Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here. The research that was previously cited while I was done while I was at Harvard. Now I've floated myself down the river and I'm at a much better institution, MIT, but also now wearing a hat at the Linux Foundation as well. And prior to that, I worked in cybersecurity and software development. So if ever there was a nerd, it would be me. Nerd in the math sense, nerd in the software sense, nerd in the economic sense. And what do nerds love? We love algorithms and we love equations. So I'm going to start us off today by talking a little bit about a very simple equation that we use in economics. And that's the value of something equals the price times the quantity or the amount that we're selling of it, right? So when myself and my team set out years ago to better understand the value that open source creates, we said, well, economics can help with this. We have some great equations. Let's start with this nice simple one. So we started with price, and of course the fun part about open source is that usually the price is 0. And so, okay, great, so we can't do anything with that. Maybe we can do something with quantity. As it turns out, we have no idea how much open source is out there, because the great thing about open source, we can copy it, we can reuse it behind the firewall, so we can't see any of things that's going on. So instead of using our friends from economics, we turned to our friends in the business world and thought about the fact that price doesn't really matter when we're trying to actually calculate the value of something. We care about what we actually get out of using it. And so with that in mind, what we tried to do was we set out to try and measure this value that companies get from open source worldwide. And so I'll walk you through a few of the calculations, but the headline number that some of you may have seen is that the value of open source is about $9 trillion across the world. Importantly, this is actually an underestimate. And sorry, I should have said $9 trillion. That's with a T. And so this is an underestimate. I'll talk about how we came to this number. And then I'll also talk about and try to give you all some ammunition to help your MBA bosses or your MBAs in your organization that were trained by me and my colleagues at business schools to understand the value and the importance and the return on investment of giving back to open source. Because I think we're now at a point in time where everybody understands the importance and the value of using open source, but not everybody understands how we can actually quantify the return on investment in giving back to open source. And so that's a lot of what we're doing at the Linux Foundation right now, is trying to build some models. Tasha will talk about one in a moment. And we're trying to understand how do we calculate the return on investment in open source. So back to the measuring at the macro level. To measure Q, we ran a few studies over the past few years to better understand what open source is out there and is being used by companies. And so we partnered with a handful of software composition analysis companies, and by working with just a handful of them, we were able to get data on over 10,000 companies and 12 million data points of the open source that they bake into the products that they sell. Again, this is only at the application library layer level, so we're not thinking about kind of packaged software or operating systems. And so again, this is definitely an underestimate because, just as an example, the kernel is not included in these estimates. But at least we have something that we can start with in measuring this quantity. And so then the next thing that we did was we thought about how to measure price. And we came up with a few different ways, but the one that was most scalable is using this thing called the Kokomo 2 model, which essentially was built for the DoD to try and estimate the costs of a package of software when they were trying to estimate for contracting purposes. But basically all it does is look at the lines of code, estimates the amount of person hours it would take to build it, and then translates that into a dollar figure. Don't yell at me. I know that lines of code is not the best way to measure the value of software. I get it, I know. We're actually, and especially in the world of Gen AI, this is basically useless now. But we're actually trying to do some studies to update some of these methods. And we've tried a few other ways of measuring P, the price of this stuff. And we come up with fairly similar estimates as well. So we have P, we have Q. We can multiply these together. Anybody here can do multiplication. Before we get into that, the P alone for the most widely used open source packages would be about $4 billion. And so think about this as if everything on GitHub or your favorite open source hosting place disappeared, and we had to recode it and write it again from scratch. That would cost about $4 billion. But where we get the almost $9 trillion is if open source didn't exist at all, and every company that used every package that's in our census here had to recode that from scratch. We also do some analyses because we live in a market economy that sort of underestimate, what if a company built these and then sold these instead? It comes in a little bit lower than that, but again, this is a lowball estimate for the value of open source. And so this is, when we think about this $9 trillion number, if open source didn't exist at all, and everybody had to do what we do with non-open source and write it ourselves or buy it from somebody else. Importantly, when we think about, it sounds big, is this big? What that translates to roughly is that every company would spend about 3.5 times more on software than they do today. And then another piece of this, and we heard a little bit about supporting the contributors behind this, about 5% of the contributors to all of these open source packages actually end up creating about 96% of the value. So one of the things that we're doing at the Linux Foundation is trying to help understand who these folks are and make sure that they have the support that they need so that the whole system doesn't collapse on itself. And then lastly, as I've already mentioned, this is just popular libraries, so this is not the whole value of open source. We're trying to refine this and do more with digging into the cloud to understand what's happening in container land and everything like that. And so keep your eyes open. This number will probably go up in the near future. So that's sort of at the macro level, right? Value created equals quantity times price. I work at a business school. We care about the value captured by a company. And here we have to start thinking about costs, right? And so what are the costs? It's everybody in this room, the labor that goes into making all the open source that we know and love. And so this is where a lot of companies get tripped up is, OK, we get it. There's this free stuff out there. It's great. We can use it. We'll do that. But why should we bother giving back? Now, this has changed over time. And Wall Street and finance has been sort of behind the 8 ball in some contexts with usage of open source and contribution. But I'm happy to say with some of the recent surveys that the LF has done, we see everybody catching up. And this is good. I think it makes the conversation easier to have within our organizations. So how do we think about value capture from using open source? Only 15 years ago, only 42% of companies used open source. Then I did some research that showed that using open source increases your corporate productivity. And so now everybody uses it. It's all my fault. At least that's what I tell, that's what I tell my wife, and she says, I don't care. And so, but more importantly, in the state of open source and financial services just this year, now we see financial services about almost everybody is using open source. But importantly, almost a quarter of companies that are using it have limitations, and you are only allowed to use it in very specific circumstances. And I think this is one thing that we have to think about more is, this stuff is free. It's mostly great. Some of it is garbage, but mostly it's good, and we know which stuff is good. And so, I think breaking down some of these barriers and understanding some of the reasons that companies limit the amount of usage of open source is something that we're trying to dig deeper with some of these studies as well. Now, on the contributing side, which I think, again, is where the conversation should be for the most part these days, even 10 years ago, we saw about 64% of companies giving back to open source in some way. This could be a simple bug fix or something like that. That hasn't gone up a crazy amount in the 10 years since that stat was run. But again, my research has shown that when we contribute back to open source, that productivity bump that you can get from using it goes 2x. And so we can get 100% more productivity out of using open source when we're making small tweaks to help it run better in our environment or adding features that we really care about with a very low level of costs. And so back on to the state of open source and financial services, here it's a little even more grim. 11% of respondents said that their company had no clear policy at all about whether or not we can contribute to open source. And almost a third said that you're only allowed to contribute to open source under some conditions again. Now, again, historically, this is actually quite an improvement for financial services. I don't know if you've ever read Michael Lewis's long-form piece about a software developer at a bank that we've all heard of before, who ended up going to jail and having all these types of things. If you've never read that, it was a fascinating picture of finance and open source about 10 years ago. Now it's definitely changed, but we're still seeing a lot of restrictions placed around the usage and contribution to open source within our industry here. And so why are these organizations limiting this? So there's two big reasons. I'll focus on the first one because I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a business school professor. The second reason is legal or licensing concerns. But the first reason is the lack of a clear return on investment. And so, we all work at banks, we're all work in financial services, so we think about if we're investing in something, what are we going to get back from that, right? Very hard to measure in the case of open source, but we're working on it. So our goal with a lot of the things that myself, my team, a broader set of folks at the Linux Foundation are trying to do is arm everybody in this room with calculators and with data to be able to say, if we contribute back, X amount, if we're adding some code or joining a governance board or, helping write documentation, we can drill down and actually understand what is it that we're getting out of doing this. And so Tasha's going to talk a little bit about what FINOS is doing this. The Linux Foundation more broadly is also, we're building some tools that are intended to kind of be seeded with data from all the surveys that we've been running, but allow you all to customize it to your own environment and better understand and better argue with my former students, your MBAs in your organization, to say that we should be contributing back to this stuff and supporting it. And so when we've already run kind of a return on investment survey from financial services. We're also going to be looking and we have out in the field now a study looking at ROI across all industries. So if you already filled out the one for financial services, thanks. Tell all your friends that we're in other industries that we're running another one, and then we'll be able to compare how well we're doing in finance to all the other industries that perhaps are not doing as well. And then lastly, again, this ROI calculator, really the goal is to answer these types of questions of, what is our return on investment? Why should I be dedicating, a full-time employee or letting somebody work 10% time of contributing back to open source? What does that do for us as an organization, given our specific organizational context? So that's the goal. And then lastly, Gabe talked about the investment side of things. Just to mention a few studies that we've done here on the startup side of things, we also see this increase, or the result that an increase in startup open source contributions leads to a whole bunch of good things for open source companies. And this is actually globally. This is not just in the US. Leads to larger VC investment, higher valuations, more likely to successfully exit. And when we think about this across the country level, obviously we're here in the US, but we were just talking about Europe as well. When we think about it at the country level, more open source investment and contribution leads to more tech startups, higher quality tech startups, and tech startups that are more globally oriented and therefore more likely to scale much more rapidly and have a larger impact on the world. So now, of course, the question becomes, when should companies do this? I would love to be able to say you should always contribute to open source, give 100% of your resources, and give back to the community, but I don't say that. So how do we think about when companies should contribute? So in a piece that I did last year, we identified sort of 5 characteristics when we would expect or when it's better for companies to contribute and be more collaborative with their competitors. The first is if tech is very early or very late stage, then we're going to see more collaboration and it's better. This is why I think in the AI context, we're still, AI's been around for forever, but I think the growth of Gen AI obviously is the whole field is taken off. And we're seeing a whole lot of collaboration and openness as a result of that being in the early stages of the tech cycle. Lower in the tech stack, this is something that I think we all can understand pretty easily. That's not where we're competing with our competitors. And so if it's lower in the tech stack, it's going to be easier to sell that we're going to be more collaborative, and the cost savings here actually matter a whole lot more. Third, whether or not the market is unlikely to be winner take all, or if you control the standards. So this one, when we think about a specific type of technology, if the market's likely to tip to some sort of specific technology, then maybe we want to be a little more competitive and less collaborative. Unless we actually control the standard and we can move the whole market to our standard, in that case, we may want to be more collaborative and get everybody on our standard, even if and then we still control it. Fourth, when we see very high or very low levels of competition, we often see more collaboration. When we're in the middle is when we see firms competing more and being less collaborative. And then lastly, again, this is useful to think about in the context of AI. When we have sort of low social acceptance or a lack of regulatory clarity, we're going to see more collaborative behaviors because we're trying to set the agenda and set the tone for how the world should think about a given technology. And so when we think about all of this in aggregate, this ends up yielding, wrong button, this notion of collaborating on the core and competing on the edges. And I think in financial services, the standards for tech, the regulation, and all these types of business enablers, there's a pretty big core that can be collaborative, and then we can compete on all the bells and whistles and everything and the services that we offer on top of that. And so, the last thing I'll mention, and before they give me the hook and pull me off stage, is that when we think about AI, again, this is from the FINOS survey, where do we in financial services think that AI is going to have the biggest impact? It's going to be on software development, is at least what all of you in this room think. I would tend to agree, and some studies that we did what's important to remember as we see this happening is that it's not just about the productivity. That Gen AI is actually going to change the way that people work and what their jobs are. So just as an example, we did some work looking at software developers and find that their coding increases by about 12%, but their project management decreases by about double that. And so fundamentally, what jobs are and how people do their job is going to change. It's not going to just make people faster, better, et cetera. How they do their job, what their job is going to change as well, and that's going to be important from a managerial standpoint. We're working on a new survey that'll be in the field this winter, thinking about measuring this in a more specific way and understanding the impact of Gen AI on open source development. And then lastly, we're also working on some forthcoming research that's looking at the value of these open models. So trying to do some of the same things that we did with the value of open source, thinking about the value that open models are creating. So the key takeaways here, open source adds $9 trillion to the economy. Your company can get twice as much out of using it if you contribute back to it. When should you contribute to it? Collaborate on the core, compete on the edges. And then AI is going to change everything in this space, including the way that people work in financial services. All right, that's it. Thanks so much. I look forward to talking later.